Thank you so much, Dr. Ford, for those kind and gracious remarks. I always say I like for my mother to be alive and listen to folks tell something nice about her daughter. And I want to say to the 100 Black women and Thelma McLeod, thank you so much. Many of you probably don't know and may be looking at the bio that was given out that I used to be national president of 100 Black women. And I got a chance to talk to women and talk about how empowered we are. We just don't know it. So thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm so honored to be with you this evening. And when Dr. Ford extended the invitation and suggested that I go and take a look at the website and see who were the former lecturers here, I was immediately intimidated. I said, I am not a scientist, nor am I technologically inclined. In fact, I'm still trying to learn how to operate my remote control. And the cameras that you aim and shoot with were designed for me. And so I'm here, though, to talk about something I do know. It's about community economic development that includes affordable and sometimes, like we like to call, workforce housing because it's more acceptable. In the context of smart growth strategies, in the context of what sometimes we hear as new urbanism, in the context of making communities sound and sustainable. So I wasn't quite sure how I was going to fit in, but Dr. Ford said something to me that really stuck. He said that although the Institute's focus is on science and technology, that cities are systems too, and that people are interested in the quality of life issues that we all have to face. And so I felt that, I would be right at home talking about what I do know. So even though what I'm talking about really relates to the city in which I live, which is Atlanta, Georgia, it applies on a national basis. It applies because of the fact that we've got to have communities where all people are invited and are welcome to live. It's not only about the city, it's about the metropolitan area, it's about our rural areas as well. And I know this because I've participated on enough national boards and committees to understand the depth of the problem that the United States face as we talk about housing our people and the simple things that we have to do in order to tackle these problems. I've learned a lot of lessons along the way, and some of which I will share with you. I have a thick little pad here of notes that was prepared with my help, but I used to drive my former staff crazy because they would write these wonderful speeches, and they would sit in the audience and say, I didn't say it. I don't remember that. And so I'm going to do a little bit of that today because I've had the pleasure of taking a tour of your city because I came in early enough to try and get a perspective of what I'm going to talk about and if in fact it was going to really touch you all and that it give you something to think about. So I want to talk to you a bit about the overall housing issues we face in this country. And then I want to talk to you about the things that drove me to create the Atlanta Neighborhood Development Partnership. And so I won't be about boasting, but I'm going to be about sharing and having a conversation with you. I want to talk about some of the myths of housing and the housing issues that affects a myriad of people from low to moderate to middle and upper income. The kinds of things that make for a sustainable community and turn cities into great cities, no matter what part of the country you live in. I believe in, and I have promoted throughout my work life, a mixed income community strategy. And I will share with you why I believe that this is an appropriate approach. and why it encompasses some of the popular notions that you're going to be trying to cope with as you rebuild and develop and expand the city of Pensacola. And it will include transportation issues, environmental issues. It includes clean water and all the other things that make for the quality of life you're looking for. I'm going to talk a little bit about establishing the right kind of relationships and partnerships that assist you and abet you into getting it done. I will talk about, maybe how you go about making the case based on my experience. The political connections you're going to have to make, because all things are politic, as you well know. And that how do you bring the unwilling to the table to participate and put the issues clearly on the policy agenda of your society. We have had the good fortune in Atlanta of having the participation at the table. And so you have on your chairs part 2 of a study that was made by us at ANDP. But it was not just about the city of Atlanta. We had to begin to look at the problems we face in a regional context. Atlanta was the core of the region, but it had lost investment as people moved out and sprawled into the surrounding communities and the surrounding suburbs. I'd like to quote Joel Cotton, and he's a futurist and a presidential fellow at the Hobbs Institute at Chapman University in Southern California. And he describes the city, he calls a city of aspiration, as one that embraces the fundamental principle that one of the historic roles of a city has been to nurture and grow a middle class, to be the engine of upward mobility, that offers affordable housing and generates entrepreneurial openings to a growing and highly diverse population. So I want to take you back in time. And I want to take you back in time to, I'm learning how to do this too, to 1949, when Congress passed the Landmark Housing Act that touted that a decent home and a suitable living environment should be made available for every American. 59 years later, we have failed to deliver on that very basic principle. Americans who work hard, whatever their profession, should be able to find decent, affordable, and safe housing. For many working people, this is not a realization. They have not been included in the American dream. Now, we have to think about who are some of these folks, because I acknowledgedly, I'm a black woman. So I'm not talking about just black folks. I'm talking about your children who have left home and gone on and got an education and come back for the entry-level job. I'm talking about the workforce that includes your teachers, that includes your workforce for your firemen, your policemen. These are the folks that make for good neighbors, and they are not included in the scenario. So what I want to talk to you a bit about is also that low and moderate income wage earner. Those are the ones who find themselves in the welfare system for a short time. They are also your children, as I indicated before, or the senior population, which I have now joined, who are also priced out of living in their community because that community has gentrified and pushed them out. So we're not talking just about poor folks, we're talking about the workforce population. So I would like to talk a little bit about the kind of jobs that used to support a family on a single paycheck that barely now keep a roof over our heads, because we're facing now the escalating prices of gasoline, the rise in home prices, transportation costs if we're going to try and buy a new car. and the lack of access to affordable housing that has had a major impact on these employees. The employees also that reach down to the carpenters and the electricians that we call late at night to come and fix something that has gone wrong. You have probably will understand what I'm talking more about when you have sat in a restaurant for a long time waiting for the waitress to show up and wait on you at the table. Or you go to your department store and you're waiting for a long time in order to get waited on behind that counter. And it's because of the fact that these people cannot live close by their jobs, and we haven't been smart enough to provide the kind of transportation access to those jobs as well. So this is a population that we must find a way to house. And I ask you to think about what I just said about the goods and services that we want to face as we want to include as we move along. Children, this is a report by the Center for Housing Policy. This is a startling number that children reside, our young children reside, 60% of them among the working poor that lack decent, affordable housing. So what does that say about us as a society? That says that we have allowed too many of our young people to grow up without the context of living close in a mixed income community to someone who may have a job that they see as role models, because we have isolated the poor. The national housing wage means that 9 times out of 10, you are paying up to 50% of your income to live in a house or an apartment. And we are not at the point that we would pay the kind of salaries. And the kind of salary in the normal household would take at least $15 an hour, not $5.70. to become a part of living in many of our communities. Our Americans take pride in calling ourselves the best housed population in the world. We take pride in saying that is a basic principle. But as I said earlier, back in 1949, we passed legislation to ensure that at the national level, and it never really happened. It is not practiced in our country. We do know that people who do live in safe and secure neighborhoods, they are better citizens. They are participating in better schools. They have opportunities to good employment. They have a positive role model that continues to make contributions to our communities. They have the opportunity to become a part of our society. We have got to make certain that it reaches our children, our parents, and ourselves. If you think about your surroundings and it fails to move you to understanding that I'm speaking of, think about your children and whether or not they can come back home to live in the community in which they grew up. Housing now, fortunately, or maybe unfortunately, has grabbed the national headlines because of the high foreclosure rates in this country. So now the conversation has shifted as to what are we going to do about a problem. Now, one of the boards that Ken said that I was too numerous to mention was that I worked with the Federal Reserve Advisory Committee on the national level. Had an opportunity to sit with the Board of Governors as we talked about strategies that were, a little on the high finance side. But at the same time, we talked about basic community concerns. And we talked about the fact that the housing market was propping up our economy at a time that when things were doing badly for us and going badly, they were always touting the fact that the housing market propped up our economy. Now, there were those of us who worked at the ground level who understood the danger of this prop, because we know that in our communities, based on the availability of subprime loans, the availability of sometimes the no interest or the adjustable rate loans, that we saw people beginning to lose their homes. And so we began to say this at the table. We knew that we all want to own our own home, and it made us gullible to what became predatory lending. And now we began to see the foreclosure rate. And we talked about this not only with our banks, but our secondary market. What is happening? It is a false prop with reference to our economy. And we were standing on wobbly legs. And so we, at the ground level, saw the big tragedy and the big accident happen because it was happening at a smaller scale within our neighborhoods. And now, guess what? The whole of the United States is facing foreclosure after foreclosure. And we're seeing it in all of our communities, high end and low end. In your state of Florida, for instance, the numbers are even worse because during the housing boom, many investors bought property as second investments with the expectations to flip. And they make a greater profit. And that will go on and on and on. So what is happening now? The Atlantic the Atlantic Monthly described the new slum of tomorrow. And those are those subdivisions that now have houses sitting vacant. There are those condos that are standing isolated on too many streets in Miami and other cities. And so what we are seeing is the future slum of tomorrow, perhaps, if we don't do something to correct the problem. And so what we see in Atlanta happening, I'm not sure about Miami, but those new condos that were supposed to go for high-end housing are now being used as rental units. We see the houses in the suburbs standing empty and people volunteering to sometimes come and cut the grass so it doesn't give the appearance that this house is empty and the weeds are overgrowing and adding blight to our neighborhood. We're beginning to see high crime rates in the suburbs that once upon a time was isolated to our neighborhoods. And so all of this is now beginning to happen, and there's a new awareness of what is going on. We are in the midst of a real crisis, and it's just not affecting the poor, it's affecting the middle-income population. It's a loss of jobs that's happening in our society. So I hope that what you're beginning to grasp is the magnitude of the problem, the ongoing need for affordable housing, and how it affects all of us. So I would ask a question that I asked a bunch of Emory students once, about a couple of years ago. And these were young social science individuals. They were taking that course. And I asked them, I said, so do you understand about affordable housing? Oh, yeah, it's for folks who got Section 8 certificates. No. So let me ask you this question this way. Raise your hand if you were raised in a city. About 3 hands went up. Raise your hand if you were raised in a suburb. And almost all the hands went up. Raise your hand if you can go back to that community in which you grew up. Now let's think about it. So it was like a light bulb going. No, well, in my community is 1 acre minimum lots. I know I can't afford that, and I don't really want to move back in with my mother. And if you're like me, I don't want you to move back with me anyway. So you have to begin to think about this. And so it's to grasp the understanding and begin to plant the seeds early. So I said to him, I said, so let's pick a neighborhood in Atlanta. What about Summerhill? Now, Summerhill was where the Olympic Games was held. What about Summerhill? What do you think it costs to live there? Oh, I think we could buy a house for about $65,000. And I said, let's try a higher figure. And so by the time I told them how much it was going to be, I said, so let's add up. Now, you're going to be a school teacher, right? Some of you are going to be a school teacher. Yes, well, how much do school teachers make? one young man, he raised his hand, he said, well, my father says that I could be, if I'm lucky, if I come out and make $45,000. I said, so, okay, in Summerhill, the average house is going now for $250,000. Do you think you can afford it? If you use the rule of thumb that the banks will use, 3 times your salary to get into the house, the light bulb goes on. So now you can't live in your parents' neighborhood, and you can't live in a neighborhood that you considered slightly undesirable, but is coming back. Where are you going to live? And these are things that you begin to plant the seeds. So I hope that you begin to grasp when I talk about a form of housing. So I ask you in this audience, raise your hand if you could afford the house you're now living in today, that you bought 10 years ago, that you can continue to afford if you wanted to buy it brand new. Yeah, not today. If you wanted to buy it today, could you afford it? You see, 1, 2, a few hands, but I didn't see a whole lot of hands over here. But that talks about today's marketplace, and if you weren't fortunate enough to buy your home way back when. And just think about it, that if your child is looking for a place because of the fact that your town had exclusionary policies where it's 1 acre minimum or 2,800 square foot, that means that no apartments can come in, no townhome units can be built. So you have excluded your child from coming home and living in a community that they know well. And they've got to go someplace else. So the current focus on a housing crisis happened because of the marketplace. But the problem of affordability has been there for a long time and was not listened to or paid attention to until we have the crisis that we have today. So in Pensacola, 63% of working individuals make less than $50,000. And I understand the median income, and correct me if I'm wrong, is just because the internet said so. $43,000 is the median income for the average working population. And so they can afford a $130,000 house. Now, I don't think anything that Dr. Ford or Tony showed me today fell in that category. That you don't have $130,000 or anything under $150,000 in downtown at all. And so if you're a renter, the news is probably even worse because you have many households who can't pay even the percentage. As I said, it go back to the rule of thumb that 38% of the total population that rents, half of those pay more than 50% of their income to keep roofs over their heads. And that leaves less for the other amenities like food that we believe are essential. And essential means also clothing and maybe a car if you have to drive into Pensacola in order to work. And so transportation again begins to have a higher role. I talk about the Hope 6 program that pushed a lot of people outside of the city, that displaced a lot of people in already neglected neighborhoods, pushing them into further decline when they have Section 8 vouchers that move into neighborhoods because their address said to the potential apartment renter who was renting, they look at the address and say, I know where you come from, so I don't want you in my community, and continues to isolate the poor and continues to make the housing demand even more negative. Housing authorities, I think, made a severe mistake when Hope 6 came along, and I understand that you're too small to qualify for Hope 6 projects here. But we used to have, as law, 1-to-1 replacement ratios for units that was torn down by the housing authority. They had to do something someplace else in order to replace that. the deficit, the negative housing deficit for affordability has increased because of a very popular program, one that I supported because it was mixed income. But the necessity of one-to-one housing replacement never went away. We never should have allowed that to happen because there was already an affordable housing problem that existed that was increased because of the one-to-one replacement ratio being taken out of the equation. You also had something else to deal with that many of us are fortunate enough not to have to deal with it, and that was the hurricanes. You had hurricanes in recent years that had dramatically changed your housing market. From what I understood in my tours today was that your housing prices have gone up as well as the value of your land. And we all know that those of us in the development community, that is the basis by which affordability begins to happen. So what happens when, all of these other natural causes have caused this to happen for you, and you already don't have in place the policies that make it happen. So the loss of housing from the storms have placed unusual demands on the housing markets here. And you have a problem that you're battling and trying to tackle. What is happening here, however, is mirrored in other parts of the country, and in Atlanta in particular where I live. So let me talk a little bit about what's happening in our region. I was saying to some of the business people I met with over lunch and those that I went on tours with, that Atlanta Neighborhood Development Partnership came about because I left home and, young girl, throw the back of my prized possessions in the back of the car, and I headed out to the West Coast. And heading out to the West Coast, I think, was the best thing that happened to me. And as I said, I'm a preacher's kid. And being a preacher's kid, I wanted to get away from Daddy, too. And I drove out west. But I think that was the best move. Because what I learned when I wasn't really paying attention during the Civil Rights Movement was the issues that my father was addressing and was based on inclusiveness. And I moved out to Stanford, California, in that area, and had the privilege of working in Silicon Valley. And in working in Silicon Valley, it was the private sector that began to say, we've got to do something about housing that is in close proximity to the jobs. Now, it wasn't about public transportation or anything. It was about how can I get a workforce closer to my plant to make the little widgets that's going to make these computers operate. How am I going to bring people in close to Lockheed so that we can have more planes flying in the air? So how am I going to get a workforce closer? And they became the advocates for affordable housing. They also, surprisingly, became the advocates for fair housing. And we were one of the first agencies created in the Mid-Peninsula of California to create what we call DOUSING, H-O-U-S-I-N-G, if you felt you have been discriminated. This was the private sector. Not me, but them, that said we have got to come up with ways that makes housing availability equitable to our workforce. And they were the ones who did that. Again, I talked to some of you today, you've heard this before. That became one of the tools placed in my storehouse of knowledge. It became important when some 13 years later, after having worked for this group called the Stanford Urban Coalition, to then move to a national foundation, where because of my experience of working in forming public-private partnerships, were then taken on a national level where they asked me to form public-private partnerships, or private-public, I like to say, partnerships throughout the United States. So in Atlanta, when I came back to it, I was surprised that the city I grew up in was no longer the city I recognized. It was not a walkable, safe community where I used to leave home and go to school. Because when we walked, my father did not think about getting up and taking me in his car to school. And if it was raining, I got an umbrella and a pair of galoshes. And I walked to school each and every day. And so I never was fat. I kept my shape because I walked, you know, and we lose our shapes because we don't walk, we drive everywhere. And so I walked 3 miles to school and 3 miles from school each and every day. But it was a day for socializing until somebody would report to my father that some young man had their arm around my waist walking down the street. But those were communities that made it possible for us to grow up being nurtured and cared for. It was a community that talked to my father about the misbehavior of the preacher's daughter having some man's arm dangling around her waistline instead of just holding hands. It was a caring community because they did not mind correcting us along the way. Miss Hattie, you are a little bit too loud today. Why are you making all that noise? That is not very ladylike. And I would accept that, but that is not today's world. So let me talk about in Atlanta, in our region. There are 1/3 of our population in the Atlanta region that makes less than $40,000. 60% of the region jobs pay less than $40,000. 83% of the households under the age of 25 make less than $40,000. These include college graduates in their first jobs with the combined cost of housing and transportation, which absorbs about 2/3 of the income. So this gets me back to talking about my organization again. ANDP was formed, I like to say, as a private-public partnership. A private-public partnership, because the predominant number of my board members were from the private sector. And from its inception, it began to position the debate around affordable housing in a mixed income environment, but not only talk about it, but demonstrate how it got done. Because one of my board members' chairs said to me, now Hattie, you can talk about community building all you want. You can talk about, you know, raising the will in the neighborhood, but if you don't put a house in place, you're going to lose us. So we added a housing development component. So we actually did development. We also did lending. We also did grant making to the neighborhoods. We became an intermediary in our community because we wanted to demonstrate the wholeness of getting the job done. And I was seen as the advocate and the spokesperson who understood the depth of the problem, but my board also had to know that too. I also knew that banks were not lending in certain communities, and it's called redlining. They just would not reinvest back in the neighborhoods. And our board had to get comfortable, and especially those people who worked in our banks had to get comfortable with what some of the real issues were about reinvestment and the fact that we had to do something and correct it. And so this whole conversation of reinvestment resulted in us investing and developing over 8,000 units of housing in a mixed income way in the city and in the region of Atlanta. And so our primary mission was to rebuild neighborhoods where people can live full, safe, and secure lives that promoted a sense of well-being and a quality of life. And that the growing populations of people become aware that the growing population of people who are priced out of home ownership in close proximity to their jobs. And we had to have the vision that began to correct some of this and provide the quality and innovative projects and products and services to create economically viable mixed-income communities. So I have to say that I was fortunate to have a founding board. Many of them sat at the table not knowing why they were at the table, other than their boss, who was the president of the company, who said, there's this new organization being formed, and there's this woman that we're not quite sure of leading the way, so you are the one who's going to go and sit at the table and tell me about it. But when I look back at that forming board, I found that that forming board was the best vehicle. And I want you to hear this. That forming board was the best vehicle because they all sat at the table with the same level of knowledge, 0. They had never worked in the community before. They bypassed those communities because they had not had to go in it. And what pushed them to sit at the table was this thing called the Olympics. The Olympics was announced. It was announced that the Olympics, we had convinced them to come to Atlanta. And oh my God, we sold ourselves as a community too busy to hate. We sold ourselves as black folks and white folks got along well together. And we have cited all of the potential stadiums in those neighborhoods. Oh my God, what are we going to do? Because now they're going to really say we lied. And so coming to this realization was how I ended up being able to do something that I was in the process of planning, to have a catalytic force that propelled me into now ratcheting it up and having these folks sitting at the table, all of them with 0 knowledge, not having been out in the community, now saying, what do we do? And for the first time, I had an audience that was going to say, what can I do to help? But let me assure you, it was not altruism. It was called in my own self-interest, to protect my downtown, to put on the right face that makes people believe that we sold the bill of goods and it was true. And I said, if you think that we can turn this around in 6 years, don't sit at this table, because it's impossible. It took 25 years for it to deteriorate, and it's not going to take 6 years for me to fix it. So if you're not going to be there for the long term, don't sit down. And so we had that long-term commitment. If Atlanta's leadership had not been what it was, because the business community was the dynamic force in Atlanta that got things done. They could talk to the governor and convince him to do something. They could talk to the mayor and convince him to do something. So I needed them to talk to each other. So you were asked the question of the leadership. Have they always been receptive to affordable housing? No. They didn't even want to discuss it. It was necessary to begin to rebuild the neighborhoods, and they knew it was necessary. It was the city, the county, and the private sector that decided they would join hands. And it was their desire that this organization not be seen as a part of a public entity because of the fact that we had to be nimble and quick. We had to be able to respond on a dime. We need to be able to invest quickly. And as I met with Thaddeus and his staff today, and no slight to many city government, you just don't work fast enough. And the property will go up, and the price of building the units will go up, waiting for it to go through the normal channels of City Hall and the bureaucratic process. So by the time that it gets done, it costs 3 times as much as it would have cost in the beginning. So ANDP was able to step in and begin to get that moving. So the philanthropic community was also important. These are some of the affordable housing of the past. But the community had to have the philanthropic community involved. Now, this is where my working for a national foundation came into play, because I knew how the insides of a foundation worked. And so, consequently, I was not one of those kind. I'm not too shy. I would ask the question, most people ask for 10,000. I asked for 100. I'm bold enough, I asked for 2 million. I asked for 4. I even stunned one of our philanthropic members by saying, he said, I'm willing to give you what I gave you last year. And that was $2.5 million. I said, that's not enough. And I said, come and dream a bit with me about some what ifs. I can't make that kind of commitment. No. He said, well, how much are you talking about? I said, I haven't gotten to that yet, but I'll let you know. And we did. We let them know by painting the kind of pictures. These were the vacant lots, the deteriorated housing, the apartment complexes, and some old residential units by the housing authority. So this is what it looked like. And so if we thought about housing in this context, there is no reason to get involved, but we knew we had to fix things. So you would ask me several questions of how I would get involved in affordable housing and how did the leadership, not only in the city. I always say that I can talk to you like I'm talking to you today, sell you a good bill of goods, and you say, well, you're speaking from your gut. It can't work. But I would say to you that any time that I had to sell someone and ask them to join me, I would bring people that my board would listen to, from the Brookings Institution, from the Atlanta Regional Commission, and I would ask them to help me deliver this message because they had more credibility in their eyesight than I would have. So the other side of it was how, in fact, do we get a lot of this done. I always used to say to my staff that I ate a lot of chicken. I showed up at a lot of dinners. I raised my hand too often to join in on the conversation and not always sure about how I was going to get it done. I said if I write my book, it's going to be about elbowing my way to the table because I was never invited. I just showed up. I learned a long time ago that if I wanted to get people to listen, I had to back it up by sound research. We reached into the Brookings Institution, the Neighborhood Technology. We created what we call the Mixed Income Communities Initiative Department. That is the group in my office that did the document that you have, which is report number 2. We ran out of report number 1. That we needed to have mixed income housing. We needed to begin to do the kinds of things that would change the paradigm in the city of Atlanta. And so, and I'm going to skip through some of this because I think I'm about running, okay? During my 16 years at ANDP, we involved ourselves with a myriad of partners. The people who sat around the table over the long term for 5 years, showed up, participated, made it acceptable for mixed income housing and affordable housing to be an acceptable term in the city and in the region. The Atlanta Regional Commission decided to show and put mixed income strategies in their ICE-T funding, so that if you wanted to qualify for some transportation dollars, that you had to have mixed income strategies involved in it. And so it was partnership building, relationship building, bringing home builders as well as city and county and state employees to the table, all of us wanting to get something done. Mickey products, this is what you have. That's the data, and I'm going to skip through so that I won't stay too long. The myths of affordable housing, showing that market values will go down if you have a mix of housing. We begin to have places that look like this rather than places that look like that. And this was in a neighborhood, a very poor neighborhood that was led by a CDC that did these townhomes. And the market study said they would sell maybe 1.5 per month. They sold out before they could finish. This is an ideal community. If you want to talk about ideal communities, places where people could live, work, learn, and play. These are neighborhoods that are in Atlanta. That's our MARTA system. We now have indoor-outdoor. We enjoy the quality of life, a mix of housing choices that gets us from the high chair to the rocking chair. These are communities that are possible, ladies and gentlemen, if in fact you have the will to make it happen. Successful choice community. These are communities that have varying housing options at many different price points. Not all exclusive high-end housing, but a mix. We must begin to train the public and the private leadership on strategies of how to get it done. Housing must not only be affordable to buy, but also to rent. And housing sustains a community when it's a mix, because of the fact that you have a mix of people living there. It needs to be a walkable neighborhood so we can park our cars and clean up our environment. We have to have solid public policies. I always say, if I had a crystal ball and I looked in it today, what would I do differently? I would have included public policy changes at the same time. I would have put in place inclusionary zoning. I'm jealous because you have the Sadowski Act here in Florida. We could not convince the Georgia legislative to have a housing trust fund. There is absolutely no way, but the city of Atlanta is making progress. We want to be like the city of Decatur, which is right outside the city of Atlanta, that has all of these mixed use, inclusionary zoning policy, high density, people that can walk to the transportation. And villages at East Lake used to be a public housing where they call it Little Vietnam. Now are places where people are living side by side and don't really care who their neighbors are as long as they're decent. We have projects that we've invested in. The argument happened one time about downtown with Centennial Park now coming online. And what are we going to do about it after the Olympics? And I raised my hand after being quiet in this room. I was the only black person in there and the only woman. And I tried my damnedest to keep my mouth closed. And I proposed that we would build mixed income housing, and the room erupted. But I said, not only am I going to propose it, I'm going to demonstrate how it gets done. And that unit in the center is the units that we built around Centennial Park that's now next to the aquarium, that's now across the street from the World of Coca-Cola. And so it is in the midst of what is happening, and they have affordable units because we invested in it. These are apartments that were going up in one of our older neighborhoods. That's mixed income. It goes on. This is a wonderful development. Hotel in the middle, condominiums on each side. 25% set aside as affordable downtown Atlanta. And that's because of the fact that we went to the table with the investment and said, for our participation, you're going to have to set aside. And the city and groups like us are sitting there making sure that it happens. This is a senior facility. We didn't have to advertise because of the fact that it was so badly needed that when we finished the last nail, we had the occupants. So I'm Hattie Dorsey, and I am pleased that you invited me.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Thank you for coming to Pensacola. in the dialogue in the wonderful stage play, Major Barbara and her father are talking, and the father tells Major Barbara, he says that poverty is the world's worst sin because it causes every other sin to flourish. Maybe something to that. Today, the Rotary Club of Pensacola was honored to have the principal of Hallmark School speak to us. She said that 93% of her students are on the assisted lunch or the free lunch program. Mm-hmm. She said that for many of her students, they have no food between Friday night and Monday morning. She says when it comes time to pay the rent, they change houses because mm-hmm. it is so bad. Mm-hmm. Now, this is in Pensacola, one of Florida's first-place cities. Now, my question is to you, as a preacher's daughter, as an incredibly successful revolutionary, do we continue to do what you've done here and at the same time ignore the poverty being caused by fatherless America? Or should we attack the fatherless America problem which causes poverty at the same time we're doing what you advocate?
Yeah. Well, I talked about the community that I grew up in, that the neighborhood, the people cared. And it was an all-black community. It was, we were segregated. But it was a community that had maids, school teachers, lawyers, all in the same proximity because of the fact that we had not very many options. But it was a community. It wasn't a suburb where you drive into your side garage and you don't have to deal with your community. We cared. Public housing and places like that were not seen as bad things. It was a temporary stopping point. It became, as we left our central city, and we left behind those who could not have other choices, that these problems began to escalate. And so why do we foster, why do I foster mixed income? Is because I know it works. Now, are we doing it all right? No. But I think that is the answer to repairing. And there's been studies showing that if, in Chicago, for instance, taking poor people and moving them into middle-income neighborhoods, and those people changed and they flourished. And so it's about that. It's changing the paradigm.
I'm glad you're here. I live in one of those communities that you're talking about. I live in Warrington, and it is a mixed community, an extremely mixed community, and it's a stone's throw from here. And we have a lot of houses in our neighborhood which are for sale right now, and they're affordable, and no one is buying them. And we have a rush of people who are in the rental business, and they are coming in. We have old people who are dying off and turning their houses over to, I don't know who. They're not our community. And they place people in our houses who are bringing our entire neighborhood down. It's as if we were going gangbusters before Ivan. We are a waterfront community. We have a beautiful waterfront attraction, and we have a lot of people who have moved in and spent, I'm not talking about money, sweat equity. Mm-hmm. I've literally torn my house down and rebuilt it, and I love the street I live on and a lot of the people. But we have people who come into the community, move into these rental houses, and no one ever looks back once they rent these properties. Mm-hmm. It isn't good for anybody. It's not good for the people who are living in them. You have to have some kind of standards. I pick up trash. Okay, I couldn't take it anymore. So I have a business in the community as well. I pick up trash almost every day after I drop my son off at school because I can't stand the beer bottles and the cans. And when the young children walk by me, I talk to them and I say, you shouldn't have to see this. And I can't look at it, and you shouldn't. You're better than this. And I'm talking about a community that's very mixed, racially, economically, socially, in every way you can imagine. It has such beautiful potential. I do not know what we can do. My neighbors, we get together. I talk to my commissioner. I talk to the Warrington Revitalization Committee. I was the Bayou Chico Association secretary for 6 years. I fought to clean up the waterway with my neighbors, not me personally alone, people in the community, businesses. We have businesses. The corridor that goes from here out to the Navy base is a disgrace. It is called Navy Boulevard. I have said, until you fix that, the houses, the communities that live on both sides of that ugly corridor will suffer because no one ever turns right or left. It is too uninviting. Businesses will never purchase properties. There are some moving in, but right now we're fighting with one that is doing whatever he wants, including putting 25-foot-high slabs of concrete, just dumping them out of Bubba boxes. We're fighting continually. And
are you asking for...
What can we do? I want to wake this community up to the fact that we have wonderful neighborhoods a stone's throw from here. Everyone doesn't have to run away from these places. We can build these up, but how? What do we do?
Well, we formed in Atlanta, and I was saying that you were a bit ahead of us. I always say the South is kind of sleepy, and we drag behind the rest of the world. But Florida put in place some things that we didn't have in Atlanta, and they were called community development corporations. You remember once upon a time that if you moved into the neighborhood, somebody knocked on your door with an apple pie. And they said, welcome, and let's talk about our neighborhood. And I would say that they became a part of, rather than just a resident. And so you've got to begin to talk about strategies of inclusiveness. As neighborhoods gentrified, there's this one neighborhood called Reynoldstown in Atlanta. And some of the neighborhoods, oh my God, all those young people coming in, and they got, as Ken said, purple hair and red hair, and what are we going to do with them? They don't look like us, black or white. So what are we going to do? But they became the entrepreneurs in the neighborhood. Amen. They became the entrepreneurs. They were the ones that opened up the coffee shop and the little quirky-looking restaurant. And they brought the entrepreneurial spirit back in. But also, Reynoldstown began to have what they call neighborhood meetings. They have a wheelbarrow theater goes on once a year that has arts and crafts by the little old ladies and some stuff by younger people, and the young people have gospel singing and rap songs. And, I mean, it becomes a neighborhood. And so that, to me, becomes the organizing spirit of a group that says, I am going to welcome you into my community. I want you to be a part of it. So consequently, that was one of the best neighborhood groups that's still in existence, that has high property values, but looked out for its senior population and looked out for its other, because they developed land and they developed units, and they were able to keep them affordable because it was through the not-for-profit organization. And they made certain that they knew who their neighbors were. And so the young man who might be littering, young man, you didn't pick up that stuff. You just dropped that bottle. Would you pick it up? Because somebody saw him. And so that's what we got to get back to, those days of old.
Let's thank our speaker.
And sustainable. So I wasn't quite sure how I was going to fit in, but Dr. Ford said something to me that really stuck. He said that although the Institute's focus is on science and technology, that cities are systems too, and that people are interested in the quality of life issues that we all have to face. And so I felt that, I would be right at home talking about what I do know. So even though what I'm talking about really relates to the city in which I live, which is Atlanta, Georgia, it applies on a national basis. It applies because of the fact that we've got to have communities where all people are invited and are welcome to live. is not only about the city, it's about the metropolitan area. It's about our rural areas as well. And I know this because I've participated on enough national boards and committees to understand the depth of the problem that the United States face as we talk about housing our people and the simple things that we have to do in order to tackle these problems. I've learned a lot of lessons along the way, and some of which I will share with you. I have a thick little pad here of notes that was prepared with my help, but I used to drive my former staff crazy because they would write these wonderful speeches, and they would sit in the audience and say, I didn't say it. I don't remember that. And so I'm going to do a little bit of that today because I've had the pleasure of taking a tour of your city because I came in early enough to try and get a perspective of what I'm going to talk about, and if in fact it was going to really touch you all and that it give you something to think about. So I want to talk to you a bit about the overall housing issues we face in this country. And then I want to talk to you about the things that drove me to create the Atlanta Neighborhood Development Partnership. And so I won't be teachers. That includes your workforce for your firemen, your policemen. These are the folks that make for good neighbors, and they are not included in the scenario. So what I want to talk to you a bit about is also that low and moderate income wage earner. Those are the ones who find themselves in the welfare system for a short time. They are also your children, as I indicated before, or the senior population, which I have now joined, who are also priced out of living in their community because that community has gentrified and pushed them out. So we're not talking just about poor folks. We're talking about the workforce population. So I would like to talk a little bit about the kind of jobs that used to support a family on a single paycheck that barely now keep a roof over our heads because we're facing now the escalating prices of gasoline, the rise in home prices, transportation costs if we're going to try and buy a new car, and the lack of access to affordable housing that has had a major impact on these employees. The employees also that reach down to the carpenters and the electricians that we call late at night to come and fix something that has gone wrong. You have probably will understand what I'm talking more about when you have sat in a restaurant for a long time waiting for the waitress to show up and wait on you at the table. Or you go to your department store and you're waiting for a long time in order to get waited on behind that counter. And it's because of the fact that these people cannot live close by their jobs, and we haven't been smart enough to provide the kind of transportation access to those jobs as well. So this is a population that we must find a way to house. About boasting, but I'm going to be about sharing and having a conversation with you. I want to talk about some of the myths of housing and the housing issues that affects a myriad of people from low to moderate to middle and upper income. The kinds of things that make for a sustainable community and turn cities into great cities, no matter what part of the country you live in. I believe in, and I have promoted throughout my work life, a mixed income community strategy. And I will share with you why I believe that this is an appropriate approach and why it encompasses some of the popular notions that you're going to be trying to cope with as you rebuild and develop and expand the city of Pensacola. And it will include transportation issues, environmental issues. It includes clean water and all the other things that make for the quality of life you're looking for. I'm going to talk a little bit about establishing the right kind of relationships and partnerships that assist you and abet you into getting it done. I will talk about, maybe how you go about making the case based on my experience. The political connections you're going to have to make, because all things are politic, as you well know. And that how do you bring the unwilling to the table to participate and put the issues clearly on the policy agenda of your society. we have had the good fortune in Atlanta of having the participation at the table. And so you have on your chairs part 2 of a study that was made by us at ANDP. But it was not just about the city of Atlanta. We had to begin to look at the problems we face in a regional context. Atlanta was the core of the region, but it had lost investment as people moved out and sprawled into the surrounding communities and the surrounding suburbs. I'd like to quote Joel Cotton, and he's a futurist and a presidential fellow at the Hobbs Institute at Chapman University in Southern California. And he describes the city, he calls a city of aspiration, as one that embraces the fundamental principle that one of the historic roles of a city has been to nurture and grow a middle class, to be the engine of upward mobility that offers affordable housing and generates entrepreneurial openings to a growing and highly diverse population. So I want to take you back in time. And I want to take you back in time to, I'm learning how to do this too, to 1949, when Congress passed the Landmark Housing Act that touted that a decent home and a suitable living environment should be made available for every American. 59 years later, we have failed to deliver on that very basic principle. Americans who work hard, whatever their profession, should be able to find decent, affordable, and safe housing. For many working people, this is not a realization. They have not been included in the American dream. Now, we have to think about who are some of these folks, because I acknowledgedly, I'm a black woman. So I'm not talking about just black folks. I'm talking about your children who have left home and gone on and got an education and come back for the entry-level job. I'm talking about the workforce that includes your so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Ford, for those kind and gracious remarks. I always say I like for my mother to be alive and listen to folks tell something nice about her daughter. And I want to say to the 100 Black Women and Thelma McLeod, thank you so much. Many of you probably don't know and may be looking at the bio that was given out that I used to be national president of 100 Black Women. And I got a chance to talk to women and talk about how empowered we are. We just don't know it. So thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm so honored to be with you this evening. And when Dr. Ford extended the invitation and suggested that I go and take a look at the website and see who were the former lecturers here, I was immediately intimidated. I said, I am not a scientist, nor am I technologically inclined. In fact, I'm still trying to learn how to operate my remote control. And the cameras that you aim and shoot with were designed for me. And so I'm here, though, to talk about something I do know. It's about community economic development that includes affordable and sometimes, like we like to call, workforce housing because it's more acceptable. In the context of smart growth strategies, in the context of what sometimes we hear as new urbanism, in the context of making communities sound